Russia has had sort of a maximalist set of objectives, and then several things down from that would be still good results for Russia in Putin's mind. Again, I think in the big geostrategic picture, Russia's already lost. But if we had sat down 10 weeks ago and said Russia is going to control a corridor all the way from Russia to Crimea, you would have said that's a pretty big win for Russia. It only looks like a loss for Russia in the context of they said they wanted to take Kiev, they said they were going to take over the whole country. And so really that, I think, is the interesting political question going down the road is there room for some kind of end of the war that leaves Russia in control of that corridor that would satisfy Russia and that Ukraine could live with?
Welcome to Weekend Office Hours with Sirish Pulusani and Professor Paul Denary. Paul, there's been some new developments since we last spoke. This war has dragged on for over 2 months now. And we had a podcast previously, The End of the Beginning, and that was a few weeks ago. So we're very much at another stage here. One of the more recent developments is that Russia recently halted the gas supply to Poland and Bulgaria. Poland is a NATO member. What implications does this have?
Yeah, first the roots of the policy. So the West has really cut off Russia's access to the international financial system, and that's really hurt the Russian currency. And so Russia has said, well, we want you then to pay for the gas that we're sending you in rubles, which would really force the Western countries then to convert dollars to rubles, which would drive the price of the ruble back up. Basically, what everybody has said, or almost everybody has said, is that's not what the contracts say. Contracts say we pay in dollars. So they've continued to do this. And so Russia has now picked two of these countries, Poland and Bulgaria, and said, okay, if you're not going to pay us in rubles, we're going to stop sending the gas. This is potentially a big deal. It's an escalation in the sense that while all the rest of this has been going on, Western Europe has continued to buy Russian gas and Russian oil. And actually, because the war has driven the prices of these commodities up, ironically, Russia's now actually making more money selling oil in particular, but also gas to the West during the war than it was before the war. And of course, that fuels the Russian war effort. What Poland and Bulgaria will now have to do is adjust to the cutoff of gas. And I haven't looked into this in detail. I think the changes made in the European gas network over the last 10 years or so, or 15 years, will make it easier for gas that's being shipped to other countries to be redistributed. It's also the case that if you're going to have a gas cutoff, this is the best time of year to do it. We're just getting into the season where nobody's heating their houses. And by all accounts, the reserves in Western Europe are sufficient to last, at least into next winter.
Okay.
What I think is going on here, though, is this is kind of a shot across the bow to Germany in particular, but to the bigger European countries, gas consumers, which is if you don't do things our way, we're going to cut all of you off. And come next winter, that's going to be tricky for you.
So this seems kind of crazy here. Western Europe is essentially fighting a proxy war against Russia, yet they continue to buy the gas from Russia. That's fueling the war effort. That's fueling the ability of Russia to combat this war even better, right? But is that the only choice? I mean, is there no other choice? Are we so reliant on Russian gas supply that this is the only thing that could work right now?
In the short term, there is no other choice, but Germany in particular, which in Germany is both the sort of politically and most economically important country in this discussion. Germany has announced plans to begin weaning itself off Russian gas. They've already done some of that, and they've got plans in place to do more. And the Germans say, and I stress they say, that it will take them till 2024 to do this, but that by 2024 they will not be needing Russian gas anymore. And essentially, that's a question of getting it from different suppliers, but in particular, building the capacity to use liquefied natural gas, which can be brought on ships from all over the world. more expensive, but it's a much more liquid, if you'll forgive the pun, market, because though, like oil, once liquefied natural gas gets put on a ship, it can come from any producing country to any consuming country.
What does Putin want to force the West to do, essentially, by doing this? So by cutting off gas supplies from Poland and Bulgaria, for him, in his mind, what is the best case scenario that comes from this?
I think what he's trying to do is to drive wedges in the Western alliance and within those Western countries. Especially, Poland is important, but Germany, again, is, I think, really the big target, which is there still are a lot of people in Germany who would prefer to appease Russia. Some prominent German intellectuals have come out recently saying we shouldn't help arm Ukraine. And I think the goal is to raise the price of this high enough for the Germans so that the Germans say, you know what, we don't want to supply Ukraine. We want to keep doing business with Russia. We want the cheap gas. So I think that's the goal. The goal is both to compel Germany not to supply weapons to Ukraine and to get the Germans themselves to commit to continuing to buy gas on Russia's terms.
In your view, what should the West's response be to this?
I laugh because, it's one of these cases where you put me in a position of having to say, well, I told you this was going to happen a long time ago. But once you take, okay, the water's under the bridge, we are where we are. I think the West is largely doing the right things, which is working very hard, very quickly to build the infrastructure needed to get liquefied natural gas into Europe, as opposed to relying on these pipelines, which can only be filled by Russian gas because it's Russia that's at the other end of the pipelines. So that's the right thing to do. There are some trickier questions. France is really not in this problem because France has continued its reliance on nuclear power. So it continues this debate, right? Environmentalists generally agree we want to reduce, burning carbon. Environmentalists generally are not very comfortable with nuclear power. Mm-hmm. And so it sort of gets that question back and forth.
I mean, they forced German government's hand into shutting down nuclear reactors, essentially, right? Or not relying on nuclear energy. And this is causing the reliance of Germany on Russia for those gas supplies at this point.
And we have the same problem in the United States. Okay, you don't want to burn carbon. You don't want to burn Russian gas. You don't want to burn, whatever oil that comes from horrible dictatorships. But we still all like driving our cars around and heating our houses and whatever, Mm-hmm. So something's got to give.
Something's definitely got to give, right? So I'm just curious: does this raise the likelihood of escalation into a much bigger global conflict? This action.
This is an interesting question. I don't think so. I'm not very alarmist about World War III. If what we mean is World War III as nuclear exchange between Russia and the West, I don't see it happening. Mm-hmm. It's already, in some respects, World War III, in that it's dragged in a whole lot of countries indirectly. Mm-hmm. The war is gradually escalating to the extent that the West, the United States, is particularly significant here, but also other countries, right? Every single one of them has moved a pretty significant distance over the last 2 months to say, we started here and now we're here in terms of how much aid and what kind of aid we'll give to Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So that's, I would say, but a minor escalation in terms of the battlefield. Mm-hmm. I think the more interesting thing that's really been discussed this week is not sort of the vertical escalation of the war, but the horizontal escalation. And here, I still don't think we're talking about Russia invading Poland or Germany. I mean, to get to Poland, they've got to get through Ukraine. To get through Germany, they've got to get through Ukraine and Poland. We don't see that happening right now. What's been interesting is this talk about Transnistria in Moldova, and we may want to come back to that later.
Definitely. So let's actually get into that. A Russian general, I think it was last week, announced plans to occupy the Transnistria region of Moldova on Friday. This is not something I assume most Americans are privy to what this even means. So please elaborate on that.
All right. So I hate to do this, but we got to go all the way back to the end of World War II. The end of World War II, the Soviets, Joseph Stalin, basically redrew the map of Europe, right? A bunch of what was Germany became part of communist Poland. A bunch of what had been Poland before the war became Western Ukraine and Western Belarus, right? So he moved the borders of Poland west. He moved the borders of the Soviet Union west. In moving the borders of the Soviet Union west, he took a slice, a chunk of what previously had been Romania. He also took a little bit of Hungary, a little bit of Slovakia. Some of that territory became the western part of Ukraine, but a big chunk of what had been Romania, he turned into a new Soviet republic called Moldova. And Moldova is this fascinating place. It's kind of to the southeast of Ukraine, between Ukraine and Romania. And it has, the language is basically Romanian, except under the Soviets, they switched the writing from the Latin alphabet to the Cyrillic alphabet. So it's basically Romanian, but with a Cyrillic alphabet. Okay. So fast forward to 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. Moldova declares independence. Well, there's a massive Soviet military base in Moldova, which makes sense because it was the very sort of southwestern part of the former Soviet Union. And if you were going to push into Hungary, for example, as they did in 1956 or elsewhere, this is where you were going to go from. So all of these Russian soldiers in Moldova, really encouraged and supported by the Russian government, said, we're not becoming part of independent Moldova. We want to stay part of Russia. And they formed this thing, right? There was a war fought. A Russian airborne unit went in under the generalship of a guy named Alexander Lebed, who later ran for president of Russia, and essentially was able to freeze that conflict in the favor of these Russian. Right? So we talk about, the Luhansk People's Republic that was declared in 2014, the Donetsk People's Republic that was declared in 2014. This Transnistria Republic was declared way back in 1992. And nobody's been paying much attention to it since, except for those of us who've been saying, if you think the Russians are like really nice guys and they want to like get along with the West and so on and so forth, why do they continue to occupy this chunk of this other state? Mm-hmm. And it was just one of those signs that Russia wasn't necessarily what we hoped it would be, but it also was an important sign of Russian tactics. You support local separatists, and they claim, right, that they're forming a local republic. They have a rigged referendum, and they say we're independent of that country. So it's the exact same model that we later saw in Georgia and in Ukraine. So now there is this slice, right? If Moldova was a slice of Romania, this is a slice. And it's called Transnistria because it's on the western bank of the Dniester River. It's a little tiny slice of territory between the Dniester River and the border of Ukraine. We've speculated since 2014 that the Russians might try to go all the way across southern Ukraine and link up with Transnistria, or that they might actually attack eastward out of Transnistria. That would give them complete control of the northern Black Sea coast. It would cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea entirely, and it would solidify their control over this area of Transnistria. So that's, believe it or not, the fastest explanation I can give for what this talk was about. The point being, though, that so far this has been a war about Ukraine. And if it gets involved in Transnistria, then it becomes a war about Moldova. Mm-hmm. And that's a spread, a contagion.
I mean, it seems like there's some strategic objectives that Russia is trying to do here with Transnistria. Mm-hmm. You said it makes it easier for access to certain parts of Ukraine and controlling the Black Sea region. Mm-hmm. I mean, what other incentives is there? Like why do they have such a big military presence there in Moldova? Is this more about just keeping and holding on to territory?
There were two benefits of doing this. One was, it was again this thing. This is what we thought the long-term plan was in Ukraine, because again, these forces have been in Moldova for 30 years now. The idea is, as long as you've got these forces in Moldova is kind of stuck, because if it does anything you don't like, you just turn the knob on the heat, and now Moldova's got a crisis on its hands, right? And so it meant that there could never be any talk of Moldova joining NATO, because NATO doesn't take members that have ongoing conflicts. And it just gave you a way of very easily, it was basically like you always had a gun to Moldova's head, right? We've got a chunk of your territory, and at any time we want, we can turn this from a frozen conflict to a very hot conflict. Mm-hmm. And potentially, right, it created this problem on Ukraine's western flank. Now, southwestern flank. In terms of Russia attacking from Moldova, from Transnistria into Ukraine, as far as we can tell, there's only a couple thousand Russian troops there. So it's probably not enough to do much, but it might be enough to draw some Ukrainian troops away. And the flip side of that is, while Russia could presumably, although it would be risky, fly troops in to Moldova from Russia to try to create a force there that could attack eastward into Ukraine, they would have to take troops away from the front lines in Donbass to do that. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't really make sense, but it was seen as an insight into what Russia's plans and strategy and goals might be. Mm-hmm. Now, again, this was one statement by one general, and we might just be already giving it way more airtime than it deserves. We just don't know.
But if something like that happens, does this, what is the international response going to be? I mean, like, does this threaten Romania's security? Does this mean, like,
Absolutely.
even increased NATO, response?
Well, I actually think that to the extent that, I should say one other thing. There were some explosions in this Transnistria Republic this week. I think a radio tower in particular was attacked. There's a big debate as to whether the Ukrainians did this or whether the Ukrainians say that the Russians did it and it's another one of these false flag operations and it's going to be used to sort of attack Ukraine from Transnistria or something like this. Again, I don't think there's enough military force in Transnistria to do much. But I think there's a danger to Russia that depending on how this war goes, if Transnistria does somehow get involved, you might see a big move from Moldova to retake that territory at a time when Russia is not necessarily in a capability of doing too much about it because it's so bogged down in eastern Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So if I were Russia, I would be leaving that territory as quiet as possible.
Mm. And there's been some major developments, especially in the U.S. Kind of response to this. I mean, just recently, Nancy Pelosi met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kiev. This was on Saturday. And then this was right after the fact that President Joe Biden announced to Congress, I think they were increasing aid to up to like $33 billion to Ukraine. So this is pretty significant. What does the United States exactly try to accomplish here with Nancy Pelosi's visit and this increased aid package?
So I'm a skeptic about politicians in general, and I should say that. And so what I'm about to say about Nancy Pelosi, those of you who are big Nancy Pelosi fans, just take with a grain of salt. She's a politician and she likes being on TV, right? And she likes, being seen as being heroic and to be a little bit cynical, right? Ukraine is the cause of the moment. Angelina Jolie was in Lviv yesterday, right? And all my friends in Lviv are sending me these pictures of, it's the place for cool people to be seen right now. So cool people are being seen there. And I don't want to disparage the work that in the attention that Angelina Jolie brings to refugee issues. But to now be a bit more serious about the Speaker of the House of Representatives, this was another sign. She's actually technically, because she's third in line to the presidency, the highest ranking American to have visited Ukraine since this war started. Now, maybe not important in this respect as the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, who were there not too long ago. The point is, it's another big symbolic sign that the United States is serious about backing Ukraine. And the rhetoric that went along with it, she was talking about we're going to help Ukraine win. Now, again, how long will that last when some new issue of the day comes up? I'm a little bit skeptical about. But the rhetoric from Washington has changed in terms of, basically helping defend Ukraine and to helping Ukraine win. What's the distinction? Well, maybe none. But I think at the beginning, the idea was, prevent Russia from conquering all of Ukraine. But there was at least an implicit idea that when some peace agreement comes, Russia's going to retain a lot of Ukrainian territory. The rhetoric that's now coming out of Washington is a little bit different. It's more towards helping Russia regain lost territory. And that gives you a different sense of
helping Ukraine regain lost territory, right?
Yeah. I'm sorry. Did I misstate that? Sorry. Yeah, for Ukraine to regain lost territory. So it's a different emphasis, and it's got to do then with how much do we provide, how long do we provide it for, and how much pressure and what kind of pressure do we or do we not put on Ukraine at some point to sign a particular kind of peace treaty. Mm-hmm. So it's important.
That's what it seems like. So it seems like the objectives, it's kind of going in the direction the United States wants in many ways, right? Meaning the fact that Russia is incurring heavy losses, and what they at the beginning, their strategic objectives I think have changed quite drastically compared to what they are right now at this point.
Correct. Although I think from the beginning, Russia has had sort of a maximalist set of objectives, and then several things down from that would be still good results for Russia in Putin's mind. I mean, again, I think in the big geostrategic picture, Russia's already lost. But if we had sat down 10 weeks ago and said Russia is going to control a corridor all the way from Russia to Crimea, you would have said that's a pretty big win for Russia. Mm-hmm. It only looks like a loss for Russia in the context of they said they wanted to take Kiev, they said they were going to take over the whole country. Mm-hmm. And so really that, I think, is the interesting political question going down the road is there room for some kind of end of the war that leaves Russia in control of that corridor that would satisfy Russia and that Ukraine could live with? Mm-hmm. Not clear. Not clear that either of them would agree to that. Yeah.
With, like you said, Nancy Pelosi is the third highest ranking official in the United States government. She just visited Kiev with Biden's major package, $33 billion. What does this look like for future U.S.-Russia relations after this war is over and everything else? Is there any future there?
No. Not. I think the position in Washington now is, and I think this is pretty widely shared in much of Western Europe now too. And again, this is the damage that Putin has done. Is I don't think anybody now thinks that they can do business with Russia while Putin is still in charge. This has shattered people's illusions, I think is the way it's seen, right, about Putin. And it's made it clear that he is, before there was this idea that, well, he's a little sneaky, he's a little bit violent, he's not always honest, but basically you can do business with the guy. There are common interests that you share. And this says no.
What about after he's gone, though? Does that change completely?
Well, so that's where I'm skeptical, and this is what I think is much more sobering. Is I think if you look at the depth of support for this war in the Russian elite and Russian society, and there's some debate about that, it's not clear to me, right? When there's a basis for a fruitful, positive relationship between Russia and the West anymore. And I would go back, I spent the early years of my life during the Cold War. In the Cold War, we never thought the Soviets were going to lose power, but there was always this very clear sense that this is not between the American people and the Russian people. This is about the Russian government. This is about this dictatorial government that represses its own people and wants to fight a battle with us. And so when the Soviet Union collapsed and when communist power collapsed in 1991, it's okay. The bad guys are gone. Now we can have a great relationship with this other Russia that's been there all along. And now there's really a question as to what is the nature of that Russia.
Yeah, I mean, so your point is essentially being is Russia is not going to change that much even after Putin is gone, though.
The question I think really comes now how does Russia change? Mm-hmm. I did talk to my students this week about Japan and Germany after World War II. Japan and Germany very much changed from what they were during World War II to what they were after. That took really two things. Took an American occupation, right? And of course, we still have troops in both countries 70 years later, 80 years later. But it also took those countries clearly recognizing that they had started the war and that they as societies had lost their bearings, mm-hmm. right? And that's actually a pretty rare thing to do for a country to say, man, we got this one wrong in a big way.
And these were countries, Germany and Japan, that were highly nationalistic. I mean, I think that was almost unimaginable to think the complete 180-degree turn that those countries did. So,
That's right.
So is it safe to say that Russia has the potential to go through the same transformation?
I'll say two things. One is I look at it right now and it seems unimaginable to me. But I guess if it happened in those places, you would say maybe it'll happen. But this war, no matter how badly this war goes for Russia, it's not going to be the kind of catastrophe that World War II was.
Exactly. Right. Those were complete catastrophes. I mean, Japan was nuked, right? I mean, it's crazy to think. So
Japan was nuked and then occupied by American troops, and again, still American troops in parts of Japan.
That was total surrender. That's not something that Russia is likely going to go through at this war.
Germany was occupied and, of course, then was divided for 50 years. And part of Germany was occupied by the Soviets, who took everything as reparations, right? Dismantled factories, moved them back, raped women, killed innocent people. So both of those societies ended up traumatized as a result of the war. I would guess that Russia, after this war, whenever it is going to be more like the U.S. after Vietnam, with a bunch of people saying, man, we were wrong about that, and a bunch of other people saying, the sort of, we just didn't fight with enough resolve, right? And, of course, the United States had about 4 decades of lingering resentment over Vietnam, and in some respects still does. The sort of Germany after World War I, where there was just this intense resentment and this sort of myth, our leader stabbed us in the back, and we should have kept fighting. So there are a lot of people in Russia, if you listen to some of the Russian commentators and read some Russian social media, Russians who are criticizing their government for not fighting this war more viciously, for not doing more to win the war.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more. But first, I just want to get to the relationship between the West and Russia might be irreparable in the future, but there's this whole set of countries, let's call it the global South, or countries of the global South. I guess the most prominent of these being China, India, for instance. How's their relationship going to look going forward with Russia?
Good question. I think it's hard to generalize, but a lot of these countries, India is a great example, have seen this as something they can benefit from, right? And India is benefiting from it primarily, and they've shown themselves very willing to buy Russian oil, which is basically saving them money. I think China sees it as being beneficial in terms of distracting the West, pulling military attention away, and so on. As was the case during the Cold War, there may be some battle of influence. And of course, this was already going on, right? China was investing lots of money in Africa, for example. And I think you're likely to see some of the Western states saying, listen, whose side are you on here? And there'll be some that want to sort of join up with the China and Russia, because China and Russia likes to support non-democratic governments. There may be some others that want to, sort of join up with the West, and a whole lot will want to play them off against each other, which is what happened a lot during the Cold War. Yeah. You switch sides, or you threaten to switch sides so that you can get more money out of one side.
How come a country like India, which is a democratic country, why don't they see Russia as a geopolitical threat?
We might want to ask somebody with family ties in India that question. So you may know more than I do about that. But big picture, I think that India's status as a post-colonial country, and particularly as an ex-British colony, still has it seeing Britain and the United States as sort of forces of historic oppression. And for whatever reason, and I just think this is inconsistency and hypocrisy, but of course there's lots of that around the world, they don't see Russia as an imperial power, despite the fact that it was the Russian Empire. It was actually in the name. And so there was throughout the global South, during the Cold War, a whole lot of sort of nationalist, anti-imperialist leaders who, because the UK in particular, historically was the big colonial country, and the United States kind of was linked closely with Britain, they were seen as the bad guys. and the Soviet rhetoric of being communist and national liberation oriented was pretty satisfactory.
Mm-hmm.
To be honest with you, I think these days it's as much about leaders wanting to do business with other leaders who don't ask too many hard questions about democracy.
The rise of authoritarianism is essentially what you're saying, is that authoritarian leaders are gaining power and they are much more likely just to do business with other leaders like that.
Right. I mean, the Modi government in India, right? India is a much less democratic place than it was 10 years ago, or 15 years ago. And so somebody who's running their country that way, also oppressing religious minorities and so on, is more likely to want to do business with people who either support that or don't criticize it, as opposed to countries that do criticize it. There's also, in the case of India, this whole question about Pakistan. India, it's like issue number 1, number 2, and number 3 for Indian foreign policy is Pakistan. And
I think Russia is the number 1 arms dealer to India, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, and the Ukrainians sold tanks to Pakistan.
Yeah. So the bottom line is this is so complicated. There's so many competing interests, the individual interests, the national interests, and the more you dig into this, the web gets larger and larger. So it's not just this crazy humanitarian crisis that's happening. There's history, geopolitics, individual personalities also involved in this. It looks like all of that combined.
I think the big question going forward is whether you sort of see the U.S. versus the West versus Russia, the West versus China, and then a whole lot of other stuff going on, or whether this really begins to congeal into two big blocks. My sense is most of the countries in the rest of the world are going to try to stay out of it. Really, rather than picking sides.
I mean, China was very much like right before the invasion started. They just seemed so buddy, Putin and Xi, right? Like they were on the train together. They were shaking hands. It was like an alliance was being formed, essentially against the United States power. But now I have to imagine that they got to be backtracking a little bit there.
Well, rhetorically, the Chinese have not backtracked. The official line continues to be that this is the West's fault and that they'll support Russia. Now, they're not sending arms, but they're buying gas and their rhetoric has all been pro-Russia. The what they're willing to do to help Russia is limited, but it's not really actually clear that Russia's asked for that much. So I think China, I mean, the other thing is from what I'm told, and I don't read Chinese so I don't read much Chinese social media, but apparently on Chinese social media, again, there's just sort of this outpouring of pro-Russian, anti-U.S. sentiment.
Not only that, they're not aware of all the things.
Chinese pot farms.
Yeah. They're not even aware of a lot of the news that we're hearing, right, here in the West. Exactly. Like they're not privy to all the information. So there's information blackouts and Russian propaganda likely happening.
But China and Russia, they their interests don't completely overlap, but they absolutely overlap on this question of rejecting the West's presumption that it has sort of a universal formula for how a country should be run, which is some version of liberal democracy. Chinese and Russians absolutely together resist that.
Yeah.
And they both absolutely resist the idea that the United States should play any kind of role as a leader in the world.
You said any kind of role as a leader in the world.
Yeah,
I mean, they don't care for like a multipolar world even. You're saying like any role in the world.
Well, they believe in a multipolar world in which Russia gets its sphere of influence and China gets its sphere of influence and our sphere of influence is in Mexico and Canada.
Yeah.
Right. And that, we don't even really use that language because we don't think we have a sphere of influence. And there is an important distinction to make. I mean, sometimes Americans are very hypocritical about this, but the Canadians, the French, the Italians, whoever it is, for all their reservations, they align themselves with the United States, not because the United States has conquered them or threatens them, but basically because we share some ideas about democracy and free markets, right? And that still is basically the difference is if other governments are joining up with Russia and China, it's because they all have an equal interest in not having to govern their countries democratically.
And one of the things we had discussed prior is obviously it's in very much Russia's interest to spread discord and polarization in the other parts of the world. The most recent event that took place on the global stage is this election in France between Macron and Marine Le Pen. What is the implication here? Because Marine Le Pen, who is this ultra-nationalist, probably kind of more pro-Russia than we would like, she lost, right?
She lost.
Yeah. What is the implication?
So there's, from the perspective of someone who doesn't like the idea of a pro-Putin nationalist running France, there's good news and bad news. The good news is she lost. The bad news is she got more votes than she did the last time around. And so there's this sense that kind of, if this continues, something bad could happen. I'm not a specialist in French politics, but I read enough to maybe not be too dangerous. French is an interesting country now because I almost want to call it a three-party system, which is very unstable. It's not exactly a three-party system, but the what I'm getting at is there is a pretty sizable, old-fashioned left in France, right? Socialists. There's a sort of very much sort of a newer phenomenon of this hard right of Le Pen, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, nationalist, anti-NATO, anti-EU, Eurosceptic. And then there's kind of this big middle. And the tricky thing is, in this case, the big middle was not necessarily totally thrilled with Macron, but the key thing was that the left said, we hate Macron, but as the leftists, we cannot vote for this far-right person. And so I think French society is very I don't want to say divided, but there's a very broad range of opinion represented in the political spectrum right now.
Is there a silver lining here in the sense that maybe we are in the West moving away from extremes? The other silver lining might be the fact that we're weaning off, fossil fuel energy and everything else, and Russian reliance on, Saudi Arabian energy, all of these different things that are happening that could possibly be really great for the world in 10, 20 years?
I think the silver lining, if there is one, is that the people in this world and the governments in this world, but even down to the regular people who believe that things like more or less free markets and democracy and civil liberties are good things, all these people have come to realize that they can't take those things for granted anymore. Part of that they realize because of the rise of people like Boris Johnson in the UK or Marine Le Pen in France or Donald Trump in the United States. But partly they realize it because Russia is actually throwing a war, a massive war, explicitly aimed at extinguishing those things in one of its neighbors. Mm-hmm. And so it's been a massive wake-up call that's, in my opinion, been long overdue.
Mm-hmm. That's good to hear in many ways, but it's still devastating events that are taking place right now. I do want to tie this in briefly. You're a professor of international relations. Mm-hmm. You're probably having conversations with your students. One of the topics you might be covering is decision-making policy and what affects decision-making policy. And this is obviously such a fascinating framework, the current events, to view all of that through, right? Yep. What are some themes that we've learned from this that you kind of share?
Well, I'm actually going to turn that around and ask, what are some of the questions we now have? Mm-hmm. And let me explain. So I wrote a book explaining sort of why Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. And I didn't think we needed to say a lot about Putin and his closest advisors, or to try to psychologize Putin in order to explain that. You could basically say, well, we have a sense of what he was trying to get at. This war, which seems crazy and counterproductive, it's hard to explain this war without trying to figure out what was he thinking. And so psychology and what was going on with his group, what kind of information was he getting? Did he know before he launched this war that most of the units that he was sending into Ukraine were only at 70%, more or less? Did he know when he told the Russian people that no conscripts would be sent into war that wasn't true? So there's all these questions about what kind of information he had. There's questions about what kind of predictions was he getting from the Russian military. I'm really curious to know, were there people in the Russian military who said, this is a bad idea? It's not enough troops to do the job. Trying to do Kiev and the East and the South is simply too much. And if so, how far up the line did those things get before somebody said, shut up, we don't want to hear it? So absolutely, I think given how badly, especially when things go badly, you have to explain the decisions, or when things seem irrational. As long as things seem kind of rational, you feel like you can make sense of them. So what is it? What do I think it tells us? I will say something specific. I would have argued, 8 or 10 weeks ago, I argued that Putin wasn't going to do this big invasion because it was too risky. And that while he's violent and he's cynical and he's dishonest, he does all of those things with a very careful eye to risks and benefits. And he really only does things like Crimea in 2014 was a perfect example. He only did that when he had all the pieces in place to basically make it a fait accompli. There was nothing anybody could do about it. This was the opposite of that. So for me, the idea of Putin being risk averse is out the window. This is a guy who now looks like a gambler. Now, then the interesting question is, has he always been a gambler and this, we just didn't see it till now? Or did something in Putin change? Right. But again, there's all this speculation. Oh, he's old, he's sick. He feels more of a need to get this done quickly, so he's more willing to. Right? It's speculation, but these are the questions we need.
But isn't this the inherent problem with authoritarianism, though? Is that the years go on, the information that trickles in gets worse and worse and worse because of fear-based policies and everything else. And so what the information he might have had 10 years ago, and maybe there's a little bit more of an open atmosphere, that's not the information he's getting. I imagine those generals were scared to tell him the truth, and anyone who didn't tell him the truth was taken out. And all of a sudden you have this small circle feeding lots of bad information, and that's just this is what causes bad actions, right?
That's just to give a sort of humorous version of it. I sort of imagine after this cruiser, the Moskva was sank, and the joke that's circulating is sort of, wait a second, you lost the flagship of your fleet in a land war to a country that doesn't have a navy. So the question I ask is, whose job was it, right, to walk into Putin's office and say, excuse me, Mr. President, I got to tell you, right, we lost, whichever, right, whether it's the version that the Ukrainians sank it or whether it's the version that we somehow managed to sink it ourselves through incompetence. I'm imagining sort of the scene outside the office when they're saying, I don't have, you go do it, right? The point we're getting at, though, is there is Putin over time has intentionally or accidentally or a combination, right, built a mechanism where it's virtually guaranteed he's not going to get good information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's no self-correcting mechanisms involved in it, exactly. And his policies. And this is when people talk about, authoritarianism versus democracies, and how authoritarian governments initially seem to have some sort of advantage because they're able to take quick decisions and everything else. And democracies are very messy. But in the long run, though, it seems to be the opposite scenario. Is that right?
Yeah. I think authoritarian government is only as good as the leader and the leadership. And, I think for 20 years, people in Russia sort of grudging, actually a lot of people in the West were like, yeah, he's getting more and more authoritarian, but look what he's done for Russia. But, you keep on betting on that same horse over and over again, and sooner or later, that horse is not going to run so well anymore.
Yeah.
And that's what's happened.
You said, look what he's done for Russia. I mean, this is going to have consequences for generations to come in Russia, in Ukraine. It's going to affect every aspect of global policy towards Russia. And it looks to be really, really devastating. And there's still a lot more to play out coming up. Thanks once again, Paul, for joining me. This is Weekend Office Hours. We have this discussion every weekend, so this is great. Many insights as usual. And have a great weekend, Paul.
You too. I'll talk to you next week.
All right. Talk to you next week. Bye.